Now, the most important thing, moderating the event tonight is the delightful Dr. Nancy Turnbull, Senior Associate Dean for Educational Programs and a Senior Lecturer of Health Policy at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. In the latter role, Nancy helps to lead the school's NPH and Dr. PH programs, field education and practice, and a range of other school-wide educational activities. She is also the Director of the Educational Policy and the Department of Health Policy and Management and serves as the Faculty Field of Study Director for the NPH 65 program in Health Policy. Nancy has served since 2007 as the Consumer Representative on the Board of Commonwealth Health Insurance Connector Authority, the health insurance marketplace in Massachusetts, and she consults to a range of consumer health advocacy groups and also serves on several other nonprofit boards and advisory groups. Thank you so much for us tonight. And tonight we are celebrating our neighbor, Dr. Jeremy Nobel. He is a primary care physician, public health practitioner, and award-winning poet with a faculty appointment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School. He is the founder and president of Foundation for Art and Healing, whose signature initiative, Project UnLonely, which addresses the personal and public health challenges of loneliness and social isolation, which has gained national visibility. His teaching and research activities focus on population health, social determinants of health, and the design and evaluation of health improvement intervention programs. With a unique background and training required to bridge scientific and humanistic disciplines, he has contributed to significant explorations into how creative expression mitigates illness and enhances well-being. And to embrace the more creative side, Dr. Nobel is also a published poet who has received several awards for his poetry, including the Baines-Wickett Prize from Penn State University and American Academy of Poets Prize from the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you so much again for being here this evening. Woo! The book we are celebrating, Project UnLonely, Healing Our Crisis of Disconnection, unpacks our personal and national experience of loneliness to discover its roots and take steps to find comfort and connection. He clarifies how meaningful connection can be nourished and sustained, and he reveals that an important component of the healing process is engaged in creativity. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm so excited for this discussion, so without further ado, our wonderful speakers for the evening.
Well, as you just heard, Jeremy's a bit of a Renaissance person. He's a physician, he's a poet, he's a CEO, he's an entrepreneur. And now he's the author of this wonderful book about what is one of the most important public health topics. So I am so delighted to be here with you, Jeremy. Jeremy's also a neighbor of mine. We both live in Brookline. We live at opposite ends of Lawrence Park. We often meet in the early morning, because we're both very early morning people, and sit on a bench and talk about things. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you. So we're going to start with a few questions for you all. So raise your hand. Oh, yeah, sure.
I see there's some people standing. There are plenty of seats here. Yeah. If you'd like to stand, fantastic. Yeah. If you want to see it, why don't we take a minute? There's nothing formal. It's going to be asking questions, show of hands.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't leave.
Don't leave.
These are not difficult questions. It's very funny. We both teach, and no one ever wants to sit in the front row. But the interesting thing about that, once you start teaching, is you realize you don't notice who's in the front row because you're always looking to the back row. So you think you're hiding there, but you're actually not. So okay. All right. So raise your hand if in the last year you know anyone who's experienced loneliness. So for those of you who are on the live stream, it's virtually everyone in the audience has raised their hand. So raise your hand now if anyone has said to you in the last year that they are lonely. It's a good group, but it's a much smaller group, and I think that's one of the issues that we want to explore. The final question is, raise your hand if you think we are more lonely since the COVID-19 pandemic started. Again, it's virtually everybody's raising their hand. So these are themes that we're going to explore in our conversation. So, but before we get started on, Jeremy, on all the really interesting ideas in your book, tell us a little bit about you. and how you came to be interested in loneliness.
So first, thank you, Nancy, for joining us here, and thanks everyone for coming. It is going to be a talk about loneliness, and what we found is often people come to a talk about loneliness because a few of them are lonely. So if you are out there and lonely, let me assure you, you're not alone. And it's coming to events like this, particularly if you can have conversations that are helpful. So you heard a little bit about my background, and I got involved in loneliness indirectly, but then as I started really exploring it, I realized I've been kind of exploring it for a long time, probably much of my life. And so it was a real journey to explore it in the shape of a book. So I actually got very involved in the arts long before I was interested in loneliness and how the arts can improve health and well-being. And I got that interest after 9/11, when in response to trauma for kids, there was a lot of activity to invite the kids to actually make art and have conversations. And a lot of this was done in the 5 boroughs, in part because the trauma levels were higher, because the local media was running the images of the planes running into the towers over and over again. People on fire falling out, these very challenging images. And adults filter out these images after a while, kids don't. So they had a kind of classic acute trauma response. They couldn't concentrate in school, they had emotional lability, and they were having sleep disturbance. And very simple activities to draw what was on their mind and talk about it seemed to have incredible positive benefit. Now, I wasn't involved in that activity, but I happened to come across an art exhibit of this children's art in the Museum of the City of New York in the summer following 9/11. And it was so compelling. I mean, the power of the art itself was compelling, but then I read that, in fact, the kids got better, and they got better across race and class, which meant something was going on in their brains in this invitation to explore something, use their imagination, and then make something, and then have conversations. I thought this was incredibly interesting. I'm an internal medicine physician, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I could tell there was something here really important to explore. I started talking to some of my academic colleagues, and they thought it was interesting, but it really didn't reach that launch threshold. So I uttered what may be some of the most ignorant words in my life. Anybody here in the nonprofit world? Which is, I'll start a nonprofit. How hard could that be? And it turns out, for structural reasons, it's much harder than for-profit, because I've started for-profit enterprises. One of the biggest differences, it's impossible to capitalize a nonprofit. Gives you a big donor, gives you 100 million, and let's go, and so on. So you have to kind of incrementalize it. So on this incremental journey, what we discovered is some of the creative expression support, which is what we did in response, thinking how do we put the arts to work in a more purposeful way and supportive programming. And it wasn't just art making, it was mindfulness, creative expression, and then what's sometimes called social emotional learning. Other people just call it having conversations about what you care about. Ends up being. So we started doing those modalities with a variety of trauma-based situations. Now, there's plenty of trauma in the world, right? So we started working with in Afghanistan. There was a lot of interest. It was, it's a long story, but soldiers were surviving in the battlefield from brain injuries that they would not have survived in prior combat because of 2 things: because of improvement in battlefield protection and in evacuation and prompt recovery response. But then they were coming back to Walter Reed, and they had significant PTSD, traumatic brain injury. And it turned out that one of the things that was very effective was using creative expression, particularly around the PTSD. So that was interesting. So then we started kind of expanding this, and after a number of years, we actually had the good fortune to recognize that things could be traumatic that you don't imagine are traumatic, right? So having diabetes is traumatic, especially if you're in a marginalized population, if you have low income, and if you don't have support. And so we were very fortunate to get some funding to study the use of creative expression as a modality in a group of middle-aged Black women with low income who were willing to come together, and they were identified by Boston Medical Center. It was funded by Blue Cross Blue Shield Massachusetts Foundation as a recognition of the importance of addressing some of these challenges in the community. And the catalyst wasn't just, okay, why don't we do something for diabetes? It was a very remarkable black theater artist named Robbie McCauley, who was on the theater faculty at Emerson College. And Robbie had contacted me because she had written a one-woman play on the black experience of having diabetes called Sugar. And in the process of writing that play, she actually did a lot of focus groups with black women who had diabetes as a way to get material for her play. And what she found is in having all these basically conversations, these were called story circles. It's a theater technique, it's well known. It's also used in political consciousness raising, where you invite people to have the empowered authority to share what's on their mind. So she put all this together. So she was busy making this play, and then she noticed something that really got her attention, which is her diabetes, which had always been very difficult to control, became much easier to control. And that was so striking to her that she sought me out to have a conversation about it. I think we had met somewhere, you know, casually through, you know, kind of the arts. And so I thought, wow, what could be going on here? And I'm a primary care physician, and I really had never heard this kind of story before. So fortunately, I was able to contact one of my friends who was a endocrinologist where I trained, and now he was working for a pharmaceutical company, but he was interested, and he said, yeah, come on down, and I told him the story. And he said, oh, she was reducing her cortisol levels. She had much lower levels of stress, and cortisol interferes with insulin metabolism, and that's what was going on. I said, I practiced you know, for quite a while, and I don't think I really knew that. Alan, Moses' name, said, I don't think I really knew that. And he said, well, I said, why not? He said, well, I'm not sure the pharmaceutical companies have figured out how to make money from this yet. So it wasn't part of the education, and it wasn't part of the knowledge base. So we thought, okay, how do we put this forward? So we actually were able to show in 6 sessions that the combination of mindfulness, creative expression, and so on actually not only statistically improved the mental health of these 12 women. Everyone who came to the first session of 6, by the way, came to every other session. That was the first, you know, sign there was something special going on with this art making. But then when we did the interviews afterwards, almost every one of them said they felt less lonely and more connected. We weren't looking for that finding. We thought it might make them less stressed. And it did that too, and it improved their mental health. So that's what put me on to this idea that there's something about the arts that can connect us. Now that was about 10 years ago. Loneliness was not as visible then. There weren't as many, you know, pontificating experts about it then. Now the good news is I could talk to almost every expert in about a week, and I did, because they were kind of lonely and they were looking for people to talk to. And they were very interested in the idea that we could take this loneliness forward into these purposeful programs. And so that eventually became Project UnLonely. And we can talk more about what we do in the arts, but that really has started this incredible interest I have in loneliness. I think the COVID certainly expanded the number of people who have an interest in it. It may also have expanded the number of people who are lonely. We could talk more about that during the discussion. But that's kind of how it all got started.
So let's, before we dive into more discussion of loneliness, let's get started by what is loneliness and why does loneliness matter?
Okay, great. What is loneliness? There's a lot of confusion about that. I call it loneliness illiteracy. So a lot of people think loneliness is being alone. It's not. There's loneliness and there's social isolation. Social isolation is objective. You can actually count it. It's the number of social contacts you have. Loneliness is the gap, the subjective gap. It's a feeling, it's a mood of the gap between the social connections you want to have and what you feel you experience. So sometimes I say if you have the universe's most powerful telescope up on Mars and it could see through walls, you could find all the isolated people on planet Earth, but you couldn't find the lonely. So that's why, so there's a difference. The other thing that often intrigues people is they're just, so as a mood and an emotion, loneliness in a way, a little bit like love, there are different kinds of love, right? There's love of country, love of family, erotic love, there are different kinds of loneliness. And as we've kind of teased that out, that's been very interesting to people too. So we may talk a little bit about that. Now as for why it's important, because even 10 years ago, there was just, we've known for decades that loneliness increases risk for some mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, addiction, suicidality. But about 10 years ago, there started to become a strong signal that it also impairs your physical health. And now it's actually well accepted that it increases risk of heart attack or stroke or death from either by 30%. Now, if this were a rare disease increasing by 30%, you'd say, okay, that's too bad. 50% of Americans will die of cardiovascular death, and if 30% of it is related to a potentially addressable risk factor, this is a public health news alert. And it also impacts dementia, diabetes, hypertension, probably because loneliness as a brain state actually has other physiologic impairments, right? It's pro-inflammatory, it reduces immune function, and so that's probably what explains a lot of the physical, in addition to the mental. And then the last thing I'll say, and possibly the most important thing about loneliness from a public health point of view, although the illness matters, is it changes how we make sense of the world, social cognition, how we make decisions about how much attention we'll play to our own self-care, how hard we'll work to coordinate with the healthcare delivery system, which is tough to coordinate with if you want to coordinate with it, but if you're withdrawn and uncertain about it. So I think loneliness is a major public health risk, and I thank our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, for drawing our attention to it as clearly and deliberately as he has.
So Jeremy, you write in your book about 3 types of loneliness. I wonder if you could talk about each of those.
Sure, it'd be a pleasure. So the first type of loneliness is psychological loneliness. Is there someone I can tell my troubles to? This is what most people think about when they say loneliness, right? Do I have a confidant? But there's another kind of loneliness that's like a societal loneliness. Do you feel systematically excluded because of some characteristic? So imagine a room filled with people and you're thinking about entering the room. Is your arrival, in your view, anticipated, welcome, and safe? And if it is, you're going to have one way of thinking and feeling about going into that room and not another. And so this kind of systematic, call it discrimination or exclusion because of a characteristic, whether it's race, whether it's class, whether it's a disability, whether it's not adhering to the conventional beauty myth of whatever time and culture you're in, that's a kind of loneliness. Even if you actually are connected psychologically. That's loneliness type 2. Loneliness type 3, which I think is very intriguing, is how are we connected to ourselves and the bigger story of who we are and the universe. So, does our life have meaning and purpose? Do we have consequence to what we do? This is why so-called the spiritual or existential loneliness. So this has been around for about 125 years too, because the modern world's changed so much. There's so much uncertainty about who we are and what matters. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that kind of loneliness too.
One of the things I loved, one of the many things I loved about the book is it's a wonderful combination of science and art and kind of personal stories. And so I wonder if there might be an excerpt from the book that you want to read to kind of illustrate.
There is.
There
I was
is.
just thinking about cleaning up on aisle 3 there.
Which one?
Somebody dropped something and I thought, oh, so life is all theater. So speaking of theater, so I am going to describe a real life event that happened that did make its way into the book. So the book does draw a lot on story because I think storytelling is an important way to convey knowledge. So here's the story. And this, you tell me what kind of loneliness it is. In 2019, I gave an early morning talk on loneliness at a senior center in Manhattan. Every seat in the hall was filled, though I suspect that the offer of a free hot breakfast might have been a bigger draw than I was. During the Q&A session that followed my talk, an older woman named Mary raised her hand. You know, she said, I come to these lecture events because people tell me it's a way to get out and meet people, but you just gave this whole talk on loneliness and it did no good. I'm still lonely. Mary choked up on the word lonely and then started crying. The people seated nearby rushed to comfort her. Some wrote out their phone numbers and asked her to call them. It was a touching moment that illustrates the power of vulnerability. Mary had divulged something personal and painful about herself, and the total strangers around her responded with empathy and concern. A simple, sincere statement of need, uncomfortable as it may have been for Mary, allowed her to show up more clearly for the others in the room, who immediately connected with her. My response to Mary that morning was to first acknowledge how rarely we even name the problem for what it is, loneliness, the absence of what we are thirsty for. It's as if in even speaking the word out loud, we confirm our own worst fears of our deep and shameful inadequacy. Instead, we sidle up to the topic saying, I wish I had more friends, or even, it would be nice to go out more. When we do muster up the courage to mutter to others, I'm lonely, in response, we often hear very simplistic prescriptions for curing loneliness. Get a pet, join a book club, volunteer at a senior center. These are all conceivably good things to do, but they don't necessarily address the underlying causes of chronic loneliness. The activities themselves are not the answer. How we engage in them make all the difference.
So if that's the case, why suddenly are we hearing so much about loneliness? You mentioned the Surgeon General. I know in the UK they've created a Minister of Loneliness. There have been bills introduced in Congress recently to create an Office of Social Connection in the White House. So why so much attention?
So here's what I think is going on. Total speculation, right? So traditionally people didn't want to say they were lonely because it made them feel they're flawed or inadequate. But there was a little window, right, during the pandemic where we were isolating, actually, to protect ourselves and protect society. So the loneliness was actually a consequence, a direct consequence of something we were doing commonly with others and for the common good. So you didn't have to be lonely, or you didn't have to be embarrassed and ashamed about saying you were lonely. So I think that created a window. Now, and from the very beginning I said, I hope we remember to say, I'm lonely, when the pandemic, the crisis was declared over by the World Health Organization and CDC back in May. I actually think we're still in the COVID era. There's still a lot of PTSD, certainly a lot of COVID-related loneliness. But I hope what we've learned from it is that we can tell our stories around it. And I think that's what we see happening.
Is loneliness actually increasing? Do we know anything about that? And I guess maybe are there populations or groups of people who are particularly vulnerable to being lonely? Yeah.
So it turns out that if you look at a lot of the studies that are being done since COVID, and there are more being done, on average, we're a little lonelier. We're not a lot lonelier, we're a little lonelier. But averages in public health are really deceiving, just like averages in many things. So there are subgroups that are very lonely. And in the book, I talk about 5 territories of loneliness, because each of these territories represents kind of an area of social navigation where you can find people who might be extremely lonely. And we'll talk about how that lonely manifests. And they're in the book, probably won't surprise you. So the first is trauma. People who've had adverse childhood events or traumatized by war, domestic violence, or even weather problems, having your house blown away. This is trauma. The second one is illness, which often is very traumatic. We can talk a little bit more about that. I've got an illness story that I think might be helpful. The third is aging itself, right? It's a time for many people of loss. But also, if you remember that third type of loneliness, it's like, wow, what did I just go through in the last 70 years? What does that add up to? And sometimes that can be very positive, joyous celebration, sometimes not so much. The fourth is difference. People who are, this is loneliness type 2. These are people who are discriminated, marginalized, put aside for one reason or another. And the fifth is the territory of the fluidity of defining identities, the inexorable way that social media is often used to distract us from the key question of who am I? Divisiveness on all fronts, politically, the wealth divide. So there are many things going on. And if you say, within each of those territories, there are some people who are still not recovered from COVID and lonelier than ever.
Do you want to read one of the stories I loved about Lillian?
Yeah, so the territory I mentioned, illness, really got my attention as a medical practitioner. I know there's several around the room, and there are 3 types of illness situations where I think loneliness is particularly interesting. One is really significant illness, life-threatening illness, cancer or major neurologic illness, because it really it puts you in touch with a lot as you do that. And I do have a story around that. But then the other type of illness is chronic illness is often quite marginalizing. I talked about diabetes, but there are other chronic illnesses that are marginalizing also. And then rare illnesses. So hemophilia, right? A rare illness is defined as an illness where there are fewer than 200,000 people in the US have it. So any one illness is rare, so you may be the only one in your high school. There are only 20,000 people with hemophilia, by the way. You may be the only person in your city if it's a small town. But it turns out there's 7,000 rare illnesses. So having a rare illness is not rare. So I always thought there was an opportunity to become, rare illness unlonely. And about 10% of the US population has one of these rare illnesses. But let's go back to something far more common, cancer. In 1992, Lily Shockney was an oncology nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital when she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. Then in her 30s, married with a young daughter at home, thank you. Lily knew enough about the illness to count her blessings. She had a strong support system of family and friends to see her through this personal crisis. That's why what happened next came as such an unpleasant surprise. When Lily called her friends with news of her diagnosis, she heard awkward silence on the other end of the line. At work, even among her nurse friends, she saw deer-in-the-headlights reactions when she told them she had cancer. In the weeks that followed, friends didn't call as frequently as before, and some went completely silent. When Lily phoned some of them, her calls went straight to voicemail, and her messages went unreturned. Lily had been working with breast cancer patients since the age of 17, but nothing had prepared her for the loneliness that came with her diagnosis. She felt hurt and abandoned, but she also understood. News of serious illness can make well people feel very uncomfortable. They're thinking, if it can happen to you, it can happen to me, Lily told me in an interview. For some people, illness stirs up frightening reminders of their own mortality. Connecting with a friend with cancer may feel to them like a connection with death. Around that time, there was an award-winning series of public service TV commercials promoting automotive safety. The spots featured a pair of crash test dummies named Vince and Larry. Anybody remember Vince and Larry? Yeah, they were great. Who cheerfully had their heads smashed, torsos impaled, and limbs torn off in crash tests without wearing safety belts. Vince and Larry emerged from the wreckage, joking as they reattached their limbs, but the ad closed with a serious admonition: you can learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belts. Lily saw one of the ads and was struck by inspiration. I said to my husband, I have to find the funny in this, she recalled. I need to share the funny so I can get my friends back on track with me, so I can get the support that I need from them. Lily called around to her friends, and rather than try to explain her loneliness and need for friendship, she asked for their help. Following her upcoming radical mastectomy, she would soon be fitted for a right breast prosthesis. Like the crash test dummies, Vince and Larry, Lily's prosthesis would need a name, and she was open to suggestions. She asked everyone to contribute and vote on their favorite name for her prosthesis. Ideas soon came rolling in, and Lily's conversations about the silly contest had the chance to turn to more meaningful subjects. Within weeks, she had a name for her prosthesis, Betty Boob. And she also had her friends back.
I love that story. So let's switch gears just a bit. So one of the major themes in the book is how creative expression can make us less lonely.
Yeah.
In other words, art can make us less lonely.
Yeah.
That's really a fascinating idea. I wonder if you could.
Yeah. It's the kind of idea that surprises people, and then it starts to make sense.
Yeah.
Because they remember when they were kids or some common thing. And I do have a little section from the book that I love because one of my favorite, I'm a poet, as you heard, and Pablo Neruda once wrote an essay, not a poem, but an essay that I think talks a lot about human exchange. And I'm going to read a section that includes some of that and then a quick commentary. The poet Pablo Neruda once wrote an essay in which he described the intimacy and meaning of interpersonal exchange. He recalled how, as a child, he once traded a fragrant pine cone for a toy sheep with a neighbor boy he didn't know. The exchange was made through a hole in the fence that separated their two backyards. To feel the intimacy of brothers is a marvelous thing in life, Neruda wrote. To feel the love of people whom we love is a fire that feeds our life. But to feel affection that comes from those whom we do not know, from those unknown to us, who are watching over our sleep and solitude, over our dangers and our weaknesses. That is something still greater and more beautiful because it widens out the boundaries of our being and unites all living things. To me, this describes the essence of creative connection, in which what has been made is not only shared, but received. It is what allows others to see themselves in us and us in them. The celebrated poet Edward Hirsch, who was also the president of the Guggenheim Foundation, was the one who brought Neruda's powerful story to my attention. He told me in an interview that the moment of simultaneous sharing and receiving of creative expression between two individuals is like, quote, an electric circuit being completed and both people are connected, end quote. It's an exchange that lets our electricity flow, allows the lights of empathy and compassion to burn brightly, and illuminates our fundamental human connection. So that's what the arts can do. And I think the other thing that's important to know is, when I first started getting interested in this, so Harvey Feinberg used to be the dean at the Harvard School of Public Health when I was there, and then he went to the Institute of Medicine. And I said, Harvey, I've got this kind of idea about the arts really having something to do with health. And he said, it's a really interesting idea, but there's no evidentiary base. Well, that was 20 years ago. Now that's changed. There's a bestseller out now called Your Brain on Art, Susan Meg-Salmon and Ivory Ross. There's really compelling brain science now that when you do art, or even behold art, it reduces the stress hormone cortisol, just like in diabetes, but it also increases the feel-good hormones, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin. So to start with, you're more relaxed and you're in a good mood. That's not a bad way to connect with people. But there's even more interesting evidence that I go into in the book that our brains have a network that tries to make sense of our social environment continually. This is called the social connector. Are we in a threatening environment? Are people threats, or are they opportunities? And that's been mapped. And so a very, I think, creative neurophysicist in the UK, Janneke van Leeuwen, said, why don't we look at what parts of the brain aesthetic experiences map to? And it turns out it maps to these parts of the brain that make sense of the world around us, which actually is an explanation of what Hirsch was saying, that the arts can actually change how we make sense of our social opportunities with other people. This is fantastically interesting. So that's one. The other thing the arts do is they really do invite us to tell our stories. And the third is they put us in touch with the bigger universe of the human experience that I think all of us, are eager to negotiate with and can connect us. So that's why I think the arts are so interesting.
Okay, so we're going to do an experiment.
Yes, we are.
You may all be wondering why you have your little pencils here. You're not going to play mini golf.
Although it is an authentic mini golf pencil.
It is. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to do some creative expression together.
Yes.
So Jeremy, you want to set this up for us?
Okay. So we're going to write a haiku. And most of you have probably heard about haikus. You've read haikus. Can I see the hands of people who've written a haiku? Okay, good. We're like 70%. So quick. Here's what a haiku is: a poetic form, Japanese origin, but it's done in other cultures too. And it's got 3 lines and a very strict number of syllables in each line. So 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second line, and then it returns to 5 syllables. So 5, 7, 5. We're going to write a haiku. And I'm going to give you the prompt. I'd like you to write a haiku about loneliness. And often haikus have images, they have feelings. You can go any direction you want, but you have a constraint on the form. And I will point out that one of the things that often makes creative work so powerful is you push against that constraint to explore things with your imagination. And you will see this, and you're allowed to count on your fingers when you say, okay, what word's going to be 5 syllables long and so forth. But we're going to give you 5 minutes to write that haiku, and then we'll do a little exercise. So 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second, 5 in the final line. Does everybody have a note card and a piece of paper and a pencil? Okay, get started. 5 minutes. I don't see as many people counting the syllables on their fingers. This is a particularly adept crowd, clearly. Oh, okay. And one of the pleasures of this exercise is to just make it fast, right? And just let your imagination, let the words come out, find them, put them in there, and then see, and be surprised by what comes out. You've got 2 more minutes. One more minute. I know some of you were done at 2 minutes, but sometimes then you scratch it out, you rewrite line 2, and it doesn't really fit with line 1 anymore. This is creative expression, and then you can't read what you wrote. Okay, wrap it up. 10 more seconds. Okay, what you've just experienced is the making part. It's actually the be curious, right, with the prompt, right, what does loneliness say, and making. And then the book actually has a call to action. Be curious, make things, have conversations. So now I'm going to ask each of you to turn to somebody you're with who you didn't come with. So someone you don't know. So Jeff, you can't share with Julie. Julie can't share with Jeff. Like, you go to the people behind you and read the haiku to each other. 1 minute each. Both people have a chance to read their haiku. Enough fun and frolic. Okay. We're getting started again. I know that was an incredibly energizing, inspiring, and connecting experience.
This is as hard as getting your class to come back.
This is harder than getting your class. Okay, we're going to get back to work.
All right.
I would love someone, if you have the courage, I would love to hear some of your haikus. Is there anyone who would like to read their haiku? And we actually have a microphone.
Okay. We have a volunteer in the second row. Oh, okay. Well, that second, still in the second.
Okay, why don't actually, two of them around. Okay, haiku on loneliness.
Okay, I mentioned a crane here. It's not a bird, it's the big red thing.
Thank you.
Lonely is the crane. Above all, it rains and sees, R-E-I-G-N-S, and so long to clap.
Yes. Everyone who reads gets a round of applause. Okay, who's next? I see another microphone here. Your poem. And your name first.
Judy.
Into your microphone.
All right, Judy. When I got this old, I worried, do I still count? The jury is still out.
Wonderful.
Oh, okay.
Name and then your poem.
I'm Jim. Went to a party. No one even spoke to me. What is wrong with me?
That classic poem. Well done. How about back on this side of the road? I see a hand up over there.
Where?
Okay. Oh, and then we'll come back.
We'll come back.
Otherwise, you'll feel really lonely.
This is Grace. I sit here with you. That trumps all the loneliness. Our eyes glitter with stars.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, two more. Your name?
Hi, I'm Lena. Shrinking, shriveling spirit. I think it dribbled down the drain. Darn.
Wow, a lot of alliteration in that haiku. Well done. One last haiku.
My name's Ashley. I found myself here in the aftermath of you. I am not alone.
Oh, beautiful, Ashley. Thank you. Okay, I'll give all of yourselves a round of applause for being curious, making things, and having conversations. Okay, so now we're going to move to some Q&A. And my first question is, how was that experience? It's fun? Yeah? I think play is one of the most intriguing things about all of this. It is fun. By the way, it increases to tell your story. I don't know what neuroscientists actually got this through an IRB. It actually increases dopamine to tell your story. It actually increases, it's pleasurable to tell our stories, which explains why some people can never stop telling their stories. Question in the back, and maybe a microphone? In the microphone, because we have...
Yeah, I have a question for you. I'm a retired physician myself. What about the role of serotonin in all of this? I mean, it accumulates. Does that make things better or worse?
The answer is probably yes. No, because in certain situations, obviously, serotonin can be, it's a neurotransmitter. It has different effects at different levels. I think what's increasingly clear, it's the interplay of different neurotransmitters. The simple view that there's a single neurotransmitter that regulates major mood states is probably an oversimplification. Now, the good news is that the methods of inquiry are getting better. But no one's figured out, where loneliness lives in the brain. There was an MIT study that, we found it in a rat. I'm thinking, really, you know what a lonely rat's like? I can understand what an isolated rat is like. I know what an isolated rat is an experimenter, but a lonely rat, not so sure. So I think we have a ways to go on the science side. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I have a question. You're saying that the arts can make a person feel less lonely for connecting with the arts. I'm an artist, okay, and you spend all your time alone. So there's that kind of, push-pull, like you feel like you should be out, socializing, but you really want to be doing your art. So, you know, I think there's one little exception there where for an artist, they feel they're connecting while they're painting, but then they're isolated.
Yeah, there are many artists here, and I think that's a common feeling, right? You're trying to express in response to some curiosity, and sometimes it takes you not towards this, oh, I'm part of the great human connection. In fact, it can take you to despair. But this is the great line for Robert Frost, the only way past is always through, you know, and you just keep going, you know, and see what's on the other side of that. So, I think, you know, and it's not like take 2 poems, call me in the morning when I say the arts work. I mean, that's just an absurd simplification, but it is a way of asking questions, exploring things, and I think in that way we can find some information that helps us make sense of who we are and how to connect with others. So I think that's why it's so powerful. But it's not like a magic bullet by any means. Thanks for the question. Others? Yes, and can you pass the...
thanks. Is there a country or a tribe or community that's known to be the opposite of lonely?
You know, I'm so interested in that. The answer is probably yes. I'm told there's some, I'm not an anthropologist, but that there are some groups where there's no word for lonely in the language, which is obviously telling you something.
And along that line, I was wondering if they had, you know, kind of figured out what keeps them together. Is it religion or commonality or...
It may be that the strength. It's a great question, Doris. You may know something about that. I mean, because I mean, it is one of the humanistic questions. What is it that holds us together? And I think certain cultures are based on we're all together, and then even the idea of an independent identity is kind of a foreign concept. But that's part of what's interesting is how varied it is. Yes.
Can I say something to that? I don't know if people watched that series about how to live to be 100. And one of the keys were that those people who were in certain countries lived like as a community. They didn't feel separated.
Absolutely. This is the blue zone kind of idea,
right.
and obviously, yes, social cohesion, and we know that being socially disconnected increases risk of dying early by about 30%.
And Jeremy, you have that interesting comparison in the book, different communities. I forget, was it in New York during a heat wave?
It was in Chicago. It was the 1994 Chicago heat wave, and Eric Kleinenberg, a sociologist, wrote about this. And there were 2 communities in Chicago equally poor. They were both poor communities. One was Hispanic, one was black. But the way in the Hispanic community, everyone knew where people were. And they would go up and check on them and so on. They would go down, to the grocery store and so on. And in the other communities, the black community, there was a lot more fear. There was isolation. People didn't know each other, and far more deaths. Now, the city of Chicago paid attention to this. And so at the next heat wave, they actually went out to find people. And there were far fewer deaths. But then when COVID happened, it's like they forgot all about it. Like they didn't think the same thing, and the same pattern happened again from 1994. So yeah, there is social infrastructure. There are things we can do other than the arts. As a society, there are things that isolate us. Particularly with aging, more people are living alone than ever before. They're just structurally things we can do too.
Well, so can we pick up on that? Because the last chapter of your book is called The Call to Connect.
Yes.
So we're sitting here in Brookline. I think many of us live in Brookline, or we live in some communities. So what can communities like Brookline and other communities be doing to really help deal with this epidemic?
Yeah, I'd love to pass out more microphones and ask people. I think it's having conversations. It's figuring out what's important. What are the trade-offs? This is, I think, how, communities can grow and thrive. And I think we've lost a little bit of that even during the pandemic, and obviously it's a trend, and then other things have changed. The number of people who are part of faith-based communities in the U.S. has gone down. That was a place where people often had connecting conversations about community, and then we haven't been as thoughtful as we could about even simple things like built environment. How much green space? How wide should the sidewalks be so people can stop and have conversations? So I think we need to be thinking about connection more broadly than just what's going on in the mind, but also what's going on in the physical spaces, the political and economic relationships we have, to get the full picture.
You want to talk a little bit, Jeremy and some of his colleagues for the last couple of years at our orientation at the School of Public Health have run a workshop called Colors and Connection. You want to talk a little bit about that? And Anna Mark, did you go to that?
I did.
Okay, good. Well, there's a student here, but talk a little bit about that and like what you have learned from working with students.
So you can imagine, you know, so the students who come to the Harvard School of Public Health come from like 36 states and 60 countries. 60 countries. It was kind of amazing. This is like 500, it's like you almost can't believe you can get that kind of diversity in 500 individuals, but we do. But you could also imagine they're kind of nervous about what are we doing here? What are we going? So we bring them together, and we do a you know, kind of a be curious, make things, have conversations exercise. We call it a creativity circle, colors and connection, and we just ask them, imagine the year ahead. You know, what are you imagining, and then how does it feel? That's the move, not to just color what you think your year is going to be like, but what are the feelings? And then you use color to express the feelings, and then we pair people up, and they share their stories with each other. And so we've now done that a couple of years, and unbelievable energy, excitement, and success on that. And it's very similar to what we did with the haiku, basically.
Yeah, it's always everyone's favorite activity. And I think it's a very lovely way for people to connect around something other than where are you from and which degree are you in. Other questions for Jeremy?
Other questions?
Yeah.
A couple of questions, and give the mic a chance to get around, because this is, we're live streaming this, so if you don't have the mic, it's going to be a little hard for the people tuning in. Yes, sir.
I'm really interested in type 3 loneliness, and I don't think it's 125 years old. I think it's as old as humanity. I mean, because it's, you know, it's an innate human desire to make a difference in the world. And that also feels like a space that maybe is shrinking, and it's becoming a bigger epidemic because, you know, we don't, a lot of people don't have jobs where that's an opportunity, or, you know, we have problems in government, and what's our role? We get a vote every 4 years. You know, we don't actually get to do a lot of these things, maybe more. So I think I found that part really intriguing of what you spoke about tonight.
And I think the only way we're going to thread our way back together around that is by going a little bit out of just kind of the rational analysis of what it feels like to be human, and explore that in other ways, through dance, through visual art, through poetry, but also through culinary arts, textile arts, and even gardening, which a friend of mine calls the world's slowest performance art. I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
I don't want to take the last question if somebody else is
Go for it.
Someone has to do it.
All right, well, I'm curious about any evidence-based practices for reducing loneliness at a big scale. So like art is interpersonal and so on, but what about bigger, more national scopes? Like what is the Minister of Loneliness doing? And
yeah, I interviewed, so the UK has a Minister of Loneliness. They've actually had 3 or 4. It's tough to hold that job. It's lonely at the top. Japan has a Minister of Loneliness too, but what they've really done is they've said this has to be a cultural activity. And so they invite community organizations, they call them charities there. One of them is called the Campaign to End Loneliness. I think that's a misnomer, by the way. The one thing I as we end, so no one has a recipe for how to do it at scale, but I think there's a greater understanding about what the challenges are, types of loneliness, territories within which those types of loneliness spirals exist. So the other thing to recognize is everyone's lonely from time to time. So to pathologize loneliness is a mistake, right? And so, you know, public health gets really enthusiastic, right? Like being lonely is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Well, that occasional twinge of loneliness is not like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But what can happen with loneliness, this is really important, is a kind of spiral. So if you get a little bit lonely, and then you start withdrawing from people, you get lonelier, and then you start changing social cognition, how you make sense of the world, and you're not that pleasant a person to be around, and then, you know, you're even lonelier, and this is a toxic spiral. So I think recognizing that early, not just in ourselves, but in other people, and using kindness and patience to kind of coax people back into connection, I think that's a very powerful strategy. You know, it's hard to organize it. You can't say, it's not like telling people to wear a seatbelt, you know, with different kind of public health campaign. But I think we can get there. Because loneliness, you know, it's not an illness. It's a signal that there's something you need. Just like thirst is a signal you need hydration. We're not embarrassed about, most people aren't embarrassed about being thirsty. Why are we embarrassed about being lonely? Well, that's a social construction. It's a cultural construction in our culture. Anything we constructed, we can reconstruct. And I think the arts can do that, the arts plus conversation, what we're doing here. I hope people feel more comfortable talking about loneliness now than when they came in, maybe know a little bit more about how it takes shape. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and there's one last thing I'd like to share. So I want to share what I think is really one of the best poems on loneliness, and I'd like to read it as a thank you to all of you for being here with Nancy and me. It's called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, a remarkable poet. Wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscape, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. So thank you all.